today. We turn our attention now north of our borders to Zimbabwe, and more specifically what looks like soaring prices at the shops. Joining us now via Skype is Zimbabwean economist Eddie Cross. Eddie, always a pleasure to talk to you. The last time I spoke to you in Zimbabwe, it was around the elections, and you raised your concerns about the inflation that was sort of sneaking into the system there. And I've got to tell you, I was at a hotel last week, and a ham sandwich was costing me 145 rand. What's going on?
Well, the fundamental problem, Peter, is that we've been running a fiscal deficit. And our fiscal deficit in 2017 was $2.5 billion US, which is about 15% of GDP. This year, it's going to be bigger, $3.2 billion, about 16% of GDP. Sustainable would be about 3%. So we're having to print money to meet this deficit, and this is resulting in the inflation. And I expect inflation in Zimbabwe to reach inflationary levels by the end of the year.
So you're saying that in 3 months' time, are we going back to the levels of 2008 and some countries in South America?
No, it won't go back to 2008. 2008, our prices were doubling every 3 hours.
Wow.
It's second highest inflation rate in the world. No, but it will be hyper. Hyperinflation is 50% or more in a 12-month period. And I think currently our inflation is around about 30%, but it's accelerating. The black market rate for the US dollar today is 180, 190. For the bond notes, about 145. And these rates are running.
All right. So help explain this to our viewers. When we say printing money, what are we printing there? Because our understanding is that the US dollar and the rand and other currencies are the currencies that are being used. Tell us about this bond note. Is that what's being printed?
Well, I'm certain they are printing bond notes, because you can see brand new bond notes on the streets and, fresh, virtually still in their wrappers. So I'm quite certain they're printing, although they're not admitting that. But it's not that's the main driving force. It's other forms of currency, treasury bills, debentures, a Reserve Bank overdraft. The Reserve Bank overdraft right now is about 3 times the constitutional limit. And wow. If we run an overdraft like that at the Reserve Bank, you're virtually printing money, but in electronic form. And it's these forms of currency that are putting pressure on the whole system.
So what can government do? I mean, President Mnangagwa has just taken over the office, and he's promised good times, but it looks like this is probably going to be his biggest hurdle in the coming days.
Well, he's just returned from China, and I think, frankly, he's walked into a storm. He hasn't yet appointed a cabinet. I just hope that the cabinet will meet our expectations, but he's got to put some people in charge now who really know what to do, because this needs management. And we haven't seen that so far in Zimbabwe. And I'm afraid that if the old guard is simply recycled, we're going to have trouble.
So on the one hand, we've got currency drama, but I see that bread is shooting up because you've had a poor wheat harvest. So that's also escalating the problem of prices and shortages.
The wheat harvest in Zimbabwe is insignificant. We grow a tiny proportion of what we need. The main problem is a shortage of foreign exchange. I mean, today in Zimbabwe, we have widespread fuel shortages. We have an impending shortage of bread. And I think that's in many fields. And I think that's one of the things that's driving the prices. You're having to buy foreign exchange on the black market and then import your goods, and that's driving up the prices.
Could any of this been foreseen? I mean, these things don't kind of just jump out of a cupboard. They come over time. Could the authorities not sense what was going on?
I think we all knew this was coming. And anybody who didn't recognize the signs is just blind. Because you can't run a fiscal deficit of 16% of GDP and don't expect this to happen. It was inevitable. And the only way to stop this is to, in fact, bring the fiscal deficit under control. And that means very painful measures. We've got to cut expenditure and raise income, both of which are going to be painful.
So you already have an informal economy, so the vendors on the streets are busy plying their trade. And that, of course, means that the government can't raise any money. So that's, again, part of the reason why I suppose they have to print money to pay civil servants.
You should be an economist. That is exactly. We are one of the most informalized economies in the world. I would say 60 to 70% of our economy is informal. It's very dynamic. It also cannot be controlled. So you've got to harness that economy in some way. And I think that's where we've got to think outside the box. And if we do so, I think we can solve our problems relatively quickly. But it won't be easy or painless.
All right, last question. How is the average Zimbabwean coping with these escalating prices and the hyperinflation that's on its way? How are they coping? How are they managing?
We are veterans. We've been through this before. 2008 was much worse than this, and we survived. Zimbabweans are survivors, and believe me, we know how to handle this situation. And that's one of the problems for government, is everybody is ducking and diving because they know what's coming.
All right, Eddie Cross, thanks very much for talking to us, and we'll catch up with you again in the next few days, I'm sure, just to see how things are going. That was Eddie Cross, Zimbabwean economist, and it's quite a scary story that's developing in Zimbabwe. Inflation growing steadily, and he predicts that they'll be in hyperinflation territory before the end of the year, and that's 50% plus in a fiscal year.